How about this? It's Friday. Another week of the offseason is over. But also, it's the end of the position review previews for spring camp. It's a Friday finish on the beat with Austin and Birm. I'm Austin. He is Birm. And we've made it, buddy. It's at the end of the road here. Interior offensive line is the last one.
Yeah, and I think if anyone ever questions our ability to be efficient or drag something out for a long time, I would point to these 4 weeks that we have used to go over the 8 different position groups on the Ohio State roster. We're here. We've made it.
We went past that. We broke up both the offensive line and the defensive line into 2.
Oh. Well, either way, we saved the most boring for last.
What?
And it's not boring to you? I don't know. I think about the interior offensive line, and it's pretty boring to me because, yes, there is some intrigue. There are a few unknown, final chess moves, but there's nothing really that dramatic about who the key players are going to be. And I think we know exactly. Really, this comes down to one position, right? One spot. So how do they determine what happens at right guard?
Which, even with that one spot, I think you and I are both in agreement that they're probably going to use multiple players to fill that. And I guess the intrigue for me is that I kind of think that the same might happen at center. We've talked about this new world, and it's not a concern. I just think it's a reflection of this era that we're in. And maybe there's a part of me that's been brainwashed by the number of times that Ryan Day has said 16 games, 17 games, got to play depth. But I mentioned this with the tackles earlier in the week. It's not just purely about Austin Serveld and his flexibility and the willingness, I think, for Ohio State to use him in whatever spot that they most need at any given moment. But I think if we're also talking about a world where Ohio State is building for the future and it doesn't want to be pressed into a corner the way that it might have been with some of the depth a year ago, there's always been years, and I've been driving this bus. You got to have chemistry. You got to have cohesion. You don't want to mess with a rotation on the offensive line. I guess I've come around to this idea that if you want guys to be ready to go in and play, they need to do that in games, and that now extends to the offensive line in a way that I didn't really envision in the past.
Yeah, but to your point, you have to. It's proven itself out over the last handful of years all around the country. The offensive line, you have to have multiple guys that can play, and it's not even you need a 6th. You need a 9th or a 10th in a lot of cases, and Ohio State has that. They're fortunate. They're one of the deepest programs in the country. But even as we look at this list of interior offensive linemen, you lose Donovan Jackson, a first-round pick. You lose Seth McLaughlin, the Remington Award winner. You lose Miles Walker, a guy that hadn't contributed in 2 years as he transfers to Boise State. And you have veteran depth here. And if you look down the list here, you have the top 3 guys, Tegra Shabola, Carson Hinsman, and Luke Montgomery. I did not list Austin Serveld on here, as I said I was going to do on Wednesday, but he's included. I just didn't want to run out of space because Austin Serveld is the guy. You have 4 players there that have played a lot of football for Ohio State and played meaningful football. Tegra Shabola, Carson Hinsman, Luke Montgomery, and Austin Serveld. So now you can feel pretty comfortable moving all those guys around at guard. I think obviously Carson Hinsman started last year at guard and he was the backup guard for Ohio State when Donovan Jackson had to be kicked out to left tackle because he had been working there and repping there. So you have 4 guys that you can feel pretty comfortable with at guard. And I do think that there's an opportunity, maybe Grambling, maybe Ohio, or Josh Padilla to get some reps at center to make sure that you're comfortable there in the event something crazy happens like it did a year ago, just so you're not forced to make those adjustments at the end of October into November. And Padilla is a guy that the coaching staff loves. There's a ton of buzz about Gabe Van Sickle that I've heard from folks, and similar in style to the way that people discussed Austin Serveld a year ago. And then you have Devontae Armstrong, who might be athletically the best of the group, but is still getting his feet wet under him and learning how to play the position. So, you have some depth. And then maybe the surprise of spring was Jake Cook and the conversations around him. And then you add Justin Terry. For all the questions we have at tackle, about do you have enough guys to step up? That is not the question here. Like, you have plenty of guys here. The question at guard and center is how do you use them all?
Yeah, I guess I would agree to your point that if it's boring to have depth and no question about talent, then yeah, the interior offensive line for Ohio State is boring,
Exactly.
which is a good thing to have. But I also think that I I want to give fair spotlight to these guys because I think there are interesting stories and like and really important and integral, as you mentioned here with Tegra Shabola, with your clever puns for anyone who's
Thank
not
you.
watching on
Yeah,
on
these are
YouTube or
good ones
10TV.
today, folks.
You really dipped into your bag here. If you're just listening on audio only, you're missing this. Berm is planting these Easter eggs out here. But like another year here for Tegra Shabola. What does that look like? We've seen ups and downs and peaks and valleys in performance, and even when it was going into the playoff, we didn't know how hurt he was, and that would have explained maybe some of the inconsistency we saw last year. I think when he was at 100%, he was pretty solid after he moved in from tackle to guard last year. But there's still room for him to grow. How high can that ceiling go? Not just for Ohio State this year and what that means for him in 2025 as a run blocker, as a pass protector, but for his NFL draft stock when we marry all of this together for other positions that have capitalized on draft positions and then parlayed that into recruiting success and building for the future. There's still, that happened here with Josh Simmons. It happened with Donovan Jackson. Um, there's still an opportunity where Ohio State has to continue to do that. And it has a new position coach, as we mentioned with Tyler Bowen, where, he's going to have to restart some of this and prove that himself. What does he do with Tegra Shabola? What does the next evolution look like for Luke Montgomery? Like even aside from just who's going to rotate, how much are they going to rotate? Like I'm curious what the physical maturation and the technique development looks like for these guys, because they're going to have to all take a step forward for the reasons that we mentioned with the run game and a new quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, Tegra Shabola, if you were to, I would imagine, survey NFL scouts and ask them which of these interior offensive linemen at Ohio State have the best combination of traits to be a potential big-time player in the NFL, I think it's probably Tegra Shabola. Consistency and confidence have been his problem throughout his time at Ohio State. I can't really recall a offensive lineman who has been essentially a starter now going into his third year at Ohio State that has maybe had less hype around him in quite some time than Tegra Shabola. And I think only Luke Montgomery athletically on the offensive line is even in the same ballpark as Tegra, what he can provide, what he can be. So it's really going to be interesting to see if the relationship with now a third offensive line coach in the amount of time that he's been signed and playing at Ohio State changes maybe the course of things for Tegra Shabola, because at the end of last year, it was Luke Montgomery and Austin Birm that seemed to be elevating. And some of that is because Tegra was playing hurt, and kudos to him. He deserves a lot of credit for not sitting out when he could have. But I also think that the best possible thing for Tegra is what Luke and Austin Birm have provided for him, which is competition and somebody to light a fire under his ass. So what Luke did at the end of last year, coming in and making his first start in the college football playoff, and immediately not just contributing and dominating on the interior offensive lineman. There's plays in that Tennessee game where anybody who's ever known Luke Montgomery knows that he is built to be the leader. He's a guy that people are going to gravitate toward. And he's a perfect example to me of how that is not something you can teach. Like, as soon as he's on the field, that part of him comes out. He's out there rah-rahing, throwing birds. I mean, if we're going to predict, if we're making BPs, bold predictions on these shows, is there any player on the Buckeyes roster more likely to get ejected in Ann Arbor in November for throwing the double birds at the crowd? Is there anybody more likely than Luke Montgomery this November?
Probably not. I think he would be the odds-on favorite. And I did wonder, Berm, you of course followed his recruitment closely. You've been around the family. You're nearby up there. He's so outgoing, Luke Montgomery. He's so personable. I just kind of had my doubts when he arrived if that was going to translate to the fiery competitor that you're describing, a double birds waving interior offensive lineman in the big house. or going out there and facing down a situation in a college football playoff game against an SEC team and being pressed into action the way that Luke Montgomery was. I knew what kind of athlete he was, but I wondered if just the way that he carried himself off the field, like he was going to be too nice to go be an actual slob. And boy, has he absolutely answered the challenge there.
I mean, that's the question we have about a lot of Ohio State football players. I in my interview with Jordan Thomas on Talking Stuff earlier this week, that was a question I had for him. Like, you're so nice. Do you have the ability as a New Jersey cornerback to step between those white lines and turn into Davis and Igbinosun between the lines and talk your trash and run your mouth? And he said that, he prefers to let his pads do the talking, but a guy like Luke is like the most affable, good, well-intentioned, nice kid. And so it was a fair question, especially because in high school, he was moving all around the offensive line a little bit, didn't really know. You don't really hurt people in high school football if you can help it. And then you see what he became in the playoff, and it was just a different type of thing. And I think the best thing about Luke Montgomery, and obviously we're going to talk about some other players here as well, is that Luke, more than anybody in the program in the last few years, I think understood that he hit a downturn last spring, that he hit a rough patch. Mm-hmm. And rather than pissing and moaning about it or complaining or blaming somebody else or saying, well, I lost my spot. Everyone, was talking about him as a potential starter last spring. And then he didn't really play until the playoff. He could have easily handled that a different way. His brother is getting ready to start his first year at Georgia. Like there was all this conversation about Luke and would he transfer? And instead of doing any of that stuff, he just put his head down and fought through it. And that is really what you have to get at Ohio State, especially if you're a kid from Ohio that has all the expectations, that has, he's a top 40 recruit in the country coming out of Findlay. So Luke has really, really turned the corner. And now when we talked to him this past spring, like, he's the first guy to be like, yeah, man, I had a real bad patch and I needed to recalibrate. And he has. And it gives Ohio State and Tyler Bowen so much opportunity to move things around because Austin Sareveld is going to start somewhere. Ryan Day said it. He's a starter. So if that's at right guard and it's just Luke Montgomery and Tegra Shabola competing at left guard, whether it's right tackle for Austin Sareveld and it's Luke Montgomery and Shabola and Phillip Daniels competing at right guard, like none of these guys are shying away from the competition, which ultimately is what makes a championship program.
Yeah, that surge from Luke Montgomery in the postseason, I don't know if we've even talked about enough how impressive that was. And the resurgence of Carson Hinsman, I know for certain that we haven't given enough deference to that. We may have talked about it in real time and his selflessness taking on this role of guard. And it looks like, hey, maybe that's where he should have been all along. He looks like a natural. He doesn't have to deal with, making the calls, barking out the signals, getting the snap done. All those things were difficult. Maybe that was the issue. Maybe he just should have been a guard. And then he has to go back to center in a playoff push and thrive there. And it was like, okay, he was ready to do this all along. Not everybody goes on the linear growth path. And there were ups and downs again here for Carson Hinsman. I think he was asked to do some things before he was ready. It's again what I'm talking about. When I say Josh Padilla needs or deserves or should get snaps, and I don't know what that looks like, the proper amount, how much of a game, when in a game, how Ohio State wants to manage that, how Tyler Bowen wants to manage that. I don't know. That's up to them. But I think that they're more open to the idea than they were in the past. And it is not because they doubt Carson Hinsman. It is to prepare for the moment when he's not the center anymore. Because if you look at the string in the years before that, the dominoes that go back to Luke Whippler in a year that Ohio State thought they were going to have him for one more year to set up for the future, put some of these guys playing catch up in a way that wasn't really fair for them. And now Carson Hinsman, again, he's another guy that fits in what you're talking about with Luke Montgomery, deserves credit for sticking through the adversity and seeing it through to the other side. And then just now it's on a rocket ship, seemingly. We'll see what this year looks like for him, but he has already earned an Iron Buckeye in the past. That makes 2 on the Ohio State offensive line. So that sent up some players for us, I think, last August. Like, well, how does Carson Hinsman fit into this? Had to deal with the illness, set him back a little bit. But boy, by the end of the year, it was hard to find any faults in what he did or the path that got him there.
It's funny because when you think about championship teams, there's always so many stories. And we tried to tell some of them this offseason, and I don't know that you can ever really tell all of them, but the Carson Hinsman story, the Seth McLaughlin story, the impact Seth McLaughlin had on Carson Hinsman, it's all, we talked about Donovan Jackson as the MVP of the team. Like, those guys are all just as important in the big picture of that story, because if Carson Hinsman wasn't willing to take a back seat to Seth McLaughlin when he arrived last January, like the Carson Hinsman Iron Buckeye thing doesn't happen. The understanding that, hey, my time is still in front of me when Wisconsin is coming calling and begging him to come home because they need help, offensive line help. Like, there was all of the conversation about Carson and the podcast that got him benched before the Missouri game, which had nothing to do with the podcast. He was being replaced by Matt Jones in practices a week before that. But
in November.
And in November, heading into the Ann Arbor, when the Buckeyes weren't sure if he was going to be the starting center against the Wolverines. Like, there is so many things in the Carson Hinsman story that could have led to him taking an off ramp and saying, hey, this is not for me. There's a kid who played tackle at a small high school in Wisconsin, came to Ohio State, again, like Tegra Shabola, had committed to Greg Studwara and signed with Ohio State. His coach, his position coach, gets fired. Justin Fry comes in, spends 3 years, does all this maneuvering around. He leaves. Like, there's all these things, all these reasons you could have left. And instead, Carson Hinsman just went out and proved himself to be one of the most valuable parts of the team. And now is in a position heading into his 4th season at Ohio State where, like, he's the unquestioned leader of the offensive line, I think. And him and Austin Sereveld are the glue. And that is, like, if you would have said a year ago that the two pieces really holding the offensive line together for Ohio State heading into the 2025 season were Austin Sereveld and Carson Hinsman, I think people would have said you were nuts.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are other trickle-down effects. If Carson Hinsman had done that, then when Ohio State got pressed into the situation...
This is a great pun, too, by the way. Austin, time and space. Yeah. Man,
I know.
Solid.
You really brought it. But then Josh Padilla would have been... have to go in and jump into the frying pan ahead of schedule. And so every player can make whatever decision they want. That's the way of the world now, and especially in college football. And if the best decision for Carson Hinsman had been to leave, like, I don't know that we could have blamed him, but it is also worth pointing out when you choose to stay and what that means for yourself, the way that you tackle adversity, and what that means for your peers and your leadership, that you're not going to make somebody else have to go through the same process that you did for Josh Padilla. So that's, taking the torch and preparing for the future. I think that's worth pointing out when that does happen. It shouldn't be taken for granted. The way that it may have been in the past where players had no choice but to stick it out or were ostracized for transferring. Like, we're in a different chapter of that part. So I think those stories are meaningful and significant. It is why we often talk so much about the brotherhood, and why, that may be to other fan bases, other programs, cliche. They're tired of hearing about it, but it is certainly real. And I think that's another example that's worth pointing out, just like Austin Sereveld here, where we're trying to figure out, is he going to play right tackle? Is he going to play right guard? All we know is that he's going to start, and we just can't have an offensive line show without talking about him in some form or fashion.
No, I mean, it's weird because he is not someone that anybody on the outside looking in would walk through a lineup of Ohio State players and be like, that guy's the leader. Because he's
not a superstar, right? I mean,
no, but he doesn't want to. He doesn't seek out attention. He doesn't want to talk. He was that way in high school too. I mean, for those of us that covered Austin's recruitment, like, it was like pulling teeth at times because he just didn't want to talk about himself. But he's an offensive lineman. You don't have to talk about yourself. Like, that's why a lot of these guys are offensive linemen. They just want to be a piece of something and they're super important, and they go out and they shut up and they do the job. But guys like Austin Sereveld, guys like Luke Montgomery, guys like Josh Padilla, for example, who have stuck it out and now is waiting for another year for his turn. That's why you recruit Ohio. That's why, like, even though sometimes recruiting on the offensive line doesn't feel as sexy as it does at other positions, this is not a position where you can recruit someone and expect to tell them you're going to come in and play. You have to have guys that are bought into something way bigger than themselves. You have to have guys that are bought into the idea of development. And that's why someone like Jake Cook, who I firmly believe is going to leave Ohio State as one of those like all-time fan favorite type of players once he starts to play for the Buckeyes, which is going to be sooner than anyone expected. Like, you have to build with these guys. So if now you look at this offensive line, you have Shabola from Ohio, Montgomery from Ohio, Padilla from Ohio, Devontae Armstrong from Ohio, Justin Terry from Ohio, Jake Cook from Ohio. If we go to the past years, that's just not the case. And so you can easily lose guys it's in this era, as you said, but it is a much bigger decision for a kid from Ohio to decide to walk away from playing for the Buckeyes. And so if you have these dudes in the state, and they're not always going to be the 5-star prospect that Paris Johnson was. Now, occasionally every 10 years, you might get lucky in the state. And Ohio State might miss out on 5-star offensive tackles from Texas or Florida or whatever. That's okay. If you have a 6'5", 300-pound Austin Sareveld in your backyard as a high school junior who's being recruited by Ohio State and Notre Dame and Alabama, or Luke Montgomery with Georgia, and like, then you better find a way to get those guys into your recruiting class. And I think Ohio State is realizing that. They've certainly seen the reward for doing so. And now you see where that takes you, because it provides that consistency and continuity and the stick-to-itiveness, which is a great word, stick-to-itiveness, that you have to develop an offensive line.
It's why, like, you and I were talking about it a couple of weeks ago, why I'm in this camp of it's okay to recruit all of the Ohio offensive linemen, 3 stars, and develop those guys, because you know that they're going to stick out, and you might be able to see that through all the way through the process, and then supplement that with the transfer portal without having to break the bank for every national 5-star. Now, I know that that's maybe not practical. Like, you may have to do it a different way, but in terms of a strategy that has worked, at least to this point, if they have to adjust it and they feel the need that they have to adjust for the future, so be it. We'll see what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, Austin, just look at this offseason, the December transfer portal window and the April one. Ohio State went out and got Phillip Daniels, who was a first-year player out of Minnesota. They tried to bring in Jaden Ball from Jaden Ball was at Purdue, right?
Yep.
He was at Purdue. He played 1 year at Purdue. The Buckeyes tried to bring him. He ended up going to Minnesota because the Gophers were going to overpay for him. Justin Terry, a 1-year guy from West Virginia. Like, in the era now of 90 or 95 scholarships that Ohio State's going to move toward, you can play this different than you have in the past. And so you went out and you tried to bring all these kids from Ohio back, but let's just not let them leave the state next time. Let's just say, hey, every year, Brian Hartline has made himself a master and probably pissed off some of his assistant coaches because and fellow assistants, because the facts are numbers are pretty static every year. And Brian Hartline said, I'm getting 4 receivers every year, period. So at some point, maybe you just say, hey, we're taking 5 offensive linemen a year. Guys are going to flush out of the program. And if 3 of them every year are from Ohio and you take the 3 best and then you go and take your massive swings around the country, so be it. But what you have in these guys, and this is a really good offensive line group for Ohio State, doesn't have the superstars that we've talked about in the past. It doesn't have the first-round picks maybe right now. But boy, this group feels like one area in a question that has a lot of questions, and a season that has a lot of questions, where Ohio State has answers and multiple answers to multiple questions. And that has to feel really good for Tyler Bowen, considering the question marks at tackle.
Yeah. I mean, you hear coaches talk about it all the time for good reason. You're building out as close to the football as possible, and then to the perimeter and everywhere else. Like, you have to be good. You have to have that nucleus up front. I think, I've said it before, we'll see what shakes out at tackle. But I believe the entire group can be as good and deep as any I've seen for Ohio State, but that's the case for sure. I can't not remember there being veteran experience, high-level production, and depth behind it, quite the way that Ohio State has stacked up right now at center and guard. It's very impressive. And, Tyler Bowen, I think, is fortunate, and he should send a thank you card to Justin Fry for that. For all of the criticisms about the recruiting approach that Justin Fry faced during his 3 years, this is a pretty good cupboard to have left to your successor.
Yeah, especially considering what he had to deal with when he took over.
Yeah. So that's it. Another week is done on the beat, and hallelujah. The spring review previews are done. We'll talk some about the coaching staff when we get back onto the beat next week because we can't leave them out. There's a lot to discuss there too, but then we'll be getting really into the current events, just like you all want. We can't ignore the roster, though, because that's how football games are ultimately won. But we appreciate you sticking with us throughout all of the spring breakdowns and spending another Friday, Freaky Friday, with us on the Austin and Birm channel. For Birm, I am Austin. Have a great weekend from 10 TV.
It's not the Austin Birm channel. The Austin
Well, it
Birm
is.
show. It's
No.
tabs, not tabs.
Shoot. Well, I'm just trying to break away from the tabs part. You know me too well. But for Birm, I am Austin. And for 10 TV, 10 TV Plus, and the Fan, and everybody watching on YouTube and the audio platforms, we appreciate you. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you Monday.